Hello, everyone. Welcome to Decolonize Your Craft, specifically sci-fi. I'm Brenda Radchik. I'm a Mexican sci-fi author, but I'm currently working on a literary novel. Would Monique like to start? Would you like to start talking about a bit about yourself?
Yes.
Give us a small introduction. I'm sorry.
Yes, it's okay. Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Monique Collins, and I am a Gala Gucci writer. My culture is very important when it comes to my writing. I'm also an English teacher, and I am the co-host and founder of Afronauts podcast. It's a speculative fiction podcast ran by Black writers.
Awesome. How about you, Kritika?
Yeah, I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Kritika H Rao. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer. My debut novel, The Surviving Sky, is coming out this year by, I think around October, by Daw Books and Titan Books. It's a story about a husband and wife duo who are trying to save their plant city from crashing into jungle storms as they're trying to save their marriage. And it's based on Hindu philosophy, which is what I tend to write about often. And yeah, decolonizing science fiction and fantasy is very close to my heart as a topic. I usually write in landscapes where I have myself lived or have had some kind of lived experience, the Hindu philosophy one, for example. And yeah, I'm excited to be here for this panel.
Awesome, thank you. And last but not least, Yulu, did I pronounce that right?
You did, thank you. I'm Yulu Ewis. It's my tribal name. In Coast Miwok, it means angry basket. It's my activism and political name. I am a fantasy, science fiction, and poet. So I write all three. My debut novel or book that just came out is a collection of poems called Ope, which means more in our language. And it is written from our point of view, saying that we are more than what happened to us. As a California Indian, we have a precarious history. So it just talks about what happened to us and how we are more than that. I am working on a novella right now. It's a series. It's called Dreamweaver. It was started out as a science fiction short story. Now it's working into a fantasy piece using Sleeping Beauty as the background. And I also own a publishing company called Bear Tracks Publishing Company. And I have a magazine, Bear Tracks magazine, which is a Native American magazine focused on California Indian issues, as well as issues federally, as well as things of missing and murdered Indigenous women and disenrollment. So it's nice to meet everybody. Hello.
Hi, thank you. Well, you all have very interesting backgrounds, and I'm looking forward to reading your work. So let's start by defining anti-colonialism. What does anti-colonial mean for you? Who would like to start?
I could go first.
Awesome. Thank you, Monique.
No problem. So to me, anti-colonial means that we aren't clinging on to traditions and practices aligned to the ideals of Western expansion. Most stories, they follow the trajectory or the plot line of the Western colonial narrative. The most popular one I can think of are the alien invasion stories. Aliens, they arrive at this planet, they kill the humans, and they take over the land. And we see that common motif portrayed again and again in a lot of Western science fiction. So to me, anti-colonial science fiction is actively telling stories and narratives that rebel against that narrative form of writing and that center the local, center the culturally relevant people and stories and histories versus centering the outsiders who are conquering the land.
I really like that. I agree. I think often just with science fiction and fantasy, because that's the genre that I can really speak to myself. There's just been such a tradition of cis het white men, who have predominantly been in science fiction and fantasy and have been defining the genre in so many ways. And now, especially, we're really seeing a resurgence of a variety of different voices, right? A lot of folks who are marginalized or come from marginalized backgrounds, etc., who haven't had a chance to tell their stories, or their voices have not been heard so far in the genre. So for me, that's what anti-colonialism means, especially when it comes to genre writing. It's not just upending some tropes, as you mentioned, Monique, like things like, that colonizer perspective of going to a planet and raising it down and, establishing new structures, etc., without any consideration for what might what might already exist. So to me, not just in terms of the narrative itself, but also in terms of structures and like plot lines and the kinds of characters that there are, like I love seeing more women and more people of color in science fiction and fantasy, and seeing that in covers as well, like with marketing and things like that. So for me, anti-colonialism is, at least in publishing and in genre, it kind of permeates everything from the tools that you're using to write, to the kinds of stories that you're telling, to the people who are working on your books, whether they're behind the scenes, your editors, and your marketing teams, you yourself as an author. All of that, I think, defines anti-colonialism when it comes to publishing. And it's such a huge, it's such a huge topic to really unpack, because publishing still is in so many ways, cis het white, and to find places to tell those stories can be still quite challenging. So yeah, for me, it's defining it is not as easy as saying this is what it is and this is what it isn't, just because like all of us to a certain extent have lived with colonialism, and we're still living with colonialist perspectives. And it's really hard to kind of, strip it down and say this is colonialist and thinking, this is anti-colonialist thinking, because when you're in it, then how do you know? Like we just don't know what we don't know. We've lost so much because of imperialist attitudes, right? So I think it's kind of like a tricky question just to even answer and think about what is it. It's everything. It's all over our cultures, right?
Absolutely.
I agree with both. It is really a struggle to define what anti-colonialism means. I mean, for me, it's just going against the traditional narrative. I try to go back as a storyteller and think about how we told stories in our tribal traditions back before we were, colonized, and that is, oral storytelling. So I take sometimes in my poetry and I do spoken word or make videos and stuff where I'm trying to do it in a way that's not written, because that's colonialist to us. We didn't write things down. So I just started finding ways to be different than what we're traditionally used to seeing, because we are part of that narrative, no matter if we like it or not.
Thank you. Yes, it reminded me of something I read the other day. I don't remember where, but it said that people are expected to write as if you were a white man. And then when you try to do that, but you aren't, you fail, obviously. So why is anti-colonial sci-fi important in general and to you? Yulu, would you like to start this time?
Sure, no problem. I really had to do research the answer to this question, because I really didn't have a good answer. But I think it's important because science fiction takes what happens in the past and brings it forth into the present and the future. So we, like Monique was saying, you have those alien invasion things, the stories, the narrative. And a lot of times when you see that narrative, we see stuff that's happened already happening, just in a different mindset and in the future. And so we can take those examples and we can flip them around and say, okay, well, we're going to change the narrative. And so we're going to show um, how it can be different, and we can explore and discover civilization in a way that is respectful to all different cultures and people, and do things a little bit differently. So I think it's a way for us to just kind of take back what was taken from us and make it our story. That's why I feel it's important to me.
I just want to jump in on that point and also just add that as you were saying, like science fiction and fantasy, like science fiction generally as a genre reimagines the future, right? And I think what has happened over the last, decades of science fiction fantasy history, at least in the Western world, is there's just been such an active erasure of, other cultures. And there's just been like no acknowledgement often of other cultures, unless like I want to say like even something like Dune, which is considered such a cornerstone of science fiction, like all it does is it uses like colonizer perspectives, puts it into like a landscape which a cishet white man has written and kind of imagined for himself and for certain audiences, and completely erases all of the influences that, like the Swana culture, which is really where so much of the Freeman, etc., got inspired from. So I think science fiction and fantasy, especially decolonizing craft and science fiction and fantasy, is important to me because it allows us to like reimagine future in such a way which we have so far been ignoring. And I think it's about time that we, as an audience of science fiction and fantasy, that we shouldn't do that anymore. For one thing, I think there's greater understanding and acknowledgement of the fact that the audiences who are reading these books, etc., are, they come from so many different backgrounds, and it's important for them to see themselves in books. Representation matters. I think we can all agree to that. So it is super important, I think, to reimagine futures in a way that they have not been imagined so far, have not been allowed to be imagined, really, right?
Yes, and I was going to say something very similar. I think when we look at science or science fiction, it's all about innovation, creating things that are new and emerging and just new technologies. And I think we have to consider art and writing the same. And if we allow ourselves to decolonize or look at writing through the lens of anti-colonial perspectives, then we're giving ourselves more room to be more innovative as writers. We can introduce new cultural perspectives, new lenses, and I think that really helps shape unique and fresh stories. So I think we can only benefit as far as the literary landscape goes if we work on bringing in new perspectives and new cultural lenses.
As well, just to kind of quickly add to that point, science fiction and fantasy hold such a lens to our world all the time, doesn't it? Right? It's not just about what we can imagine for the future, but it's also our current political commentary, and like our current politics in the world are fraught with, I don't even know where to begin, honestly, to begin speaking about that, but it's fraught with all kinds of complications because of colonialist perspectives. I think the last 5-6 years, at least in North America, have been terrible for so many different kinds of peoples, and they continue to be right now. And a lot of that has to do with white supremacist attitudes. It has to do with, colonist tendencies and thinking. And what science fiction and fantasy does is it holds up a mirror often way more than literary fiction, I would argue, and shows us that this is the world that we live in, and that it does not have to be the world that we live in. Like there's different ways that we can, imagine ourselves and our societies and our communities, etc. So that's another reason why this is so important right now. I mean, we are having books being banned in the US right now. People are taking all kinds of extreme measures to ensure that certain voices are never heard and completely erased, etc. So in such a political landscape, it's all the more important that, we continue to decolonize our craft and our fiction as much as we can. And I think that responsibility lies not just with people who belong to those identities, but also people who don't, like whether they're allies, whether they need to help raise those voices or pass the mic or whatever, beyond just performative allyship. So all of these form like really important pieces of decolonizing craft and why it's important.
Thank you. I really love that, what you said about science fiction and fantasy being a mirror, but we can also write things as we wish they were, not as they are. And how does one incorporate anti-colonial principles in sci-fi? Would you like to start, Kritika?
I think that's such a loaded question. Like, how do you incorporate anti-colonial principles? Because I think the first thing you need to do is identify what are colonial principles in order to, start thinking about what is anti-colonial principles, and then to incorporate that into your culture. I think often we don't look at capitalism as something which is a very colonial way of, living and thinking, but it is a political system that is very colonial in its, perspective. So I think the way that I do it, and I can only speak to it for myself, right? The way that I incorporate anti-colonial principles is to really think of a world which is as just, as equal, as equitable as possible. And I think what happens is, as science fiction and fantasy writers, when we're looking at world building, etc., we're obviously looking for conflict within our worlds, but we can imagine what those conflicts can be. They don't necessarily need to be about race. They don't necessarily need to be about class. They don't necessarily need to be about, any one thing. We don't need to uphold those very principles that have been held forever. Or if we do, then I think we have the opportunity and a chance to turn, as I've said before, to hold up a mirror and to show that this is not necessarily the right way to imagine our future. So, for example, once upon a time, you would have stories about, this is like such a trite example, but stories about emperors and queens and, whatever, going ahead and like saving certain peoples or being the heroes of, certain stories. But I think what that often does is gives voice to things like white saviorism and things like that, right? So I think it's very important within our own worlds to think of whether or not, first of all, what is, a colonialist perspective and what is a colonialist principle, and then how we can subvert that in our own work, whether it is through the narratives or the characters or just the thematic elements that we put into it. For example, in my debut, The Surviving Sky, there's certainly classism. There's no racism. There is no, homophobia and things like that. But there is definite classism. And the reason I've deliberately put that in is to raise a lens to our world and to show, that sometimes the colonialist perspectives seep into even the most idyllic of societies. So because we have lived under colonialism for so long, all of the world in so many different ways, I think it's almost such an act of revolution to even imagine what an anti-colonial principle can be, if that makes sense.
I think it ultimately starts with decolonizing your own mind. I think it's very hard to write anti-colonial fiction of any kind if you're not aware of your own biases and your own belief systems that speak to those colonial principles and ways of thinking. So I think the journey starts there, understanding your word choice, the diction you're using in your stories, and also understanding just the root of the structure of your stories, the narrative writing process, and then determining what are you going to do to, first of all, to face the fact that you are a product of your society and you are thinking in ways that could be harmful to your own culture and also other cultures. And then what do you do with that? But I think it starts with the realization, because I know for me, for a long time, I wasn't aware that I was buying in to certain stereotypes and to certain normative quote unquote forms of writing, especially if you have no examples or very few examples of what it means to write in that way. And you find yourself falling into the trap of writing just like the white voices you've read, for example, or writing just like the literature or the texts that were available to you. So it can be hard, especially when you pick up a sci-fi book and no one looks like you in that book. And so it starts there, I think, decolonizing your own mind.
I agree with Monique. I think that is a very important way to incorporate the principle into our own writing, is being able to just, again, change all those things that we have been indoctrinated into. You know, so I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and there's a thought that went through my head. And then afterward, I was like, oh my gosh, like I realized how indoctrinated into the dogma that I was, that the stuff that I didn't even realize that I was even doing that. And so I think that happens in our writing as well, is not knowing how to be different because we haven't seen it, not having those examples. So it's like sometimes we have to be that example. And so just trying, so it's basically defining what anti-colonialism is, what the principles are, and then how being able to just kind of defer away from that, changing the narrative and writing in a way that is that just shows how, you know, in science fiction, how we want the world to be, you know, kind of very aspirational.
And just to very quickly add to that point as well, I think it's, as Monique was also saying, it's examining like everything from narratives to things like tropes and your structures and your choices, like how you're building your narratives and the kind of power systems that you're upholding within your own work, right? I think that's a really important thing to think about. And you have certain tropes in science fiction and fantasy where power comes or originates maybe from a certain individual, you know, or a certain family and things like that. And if that is the kind of narrative you're writing, I think it's really important to understand that you are buying into a colonialist way of thinking, colonialist narrative. It's important to kind of reshape your narrative and imagine constructive possibilities in the place of whatever already exists, and to see what kind of stereotypes you're enforcing. Are people who belong to a certain culture, are all of them represented in this one particular way only? You know, is it like a world of hats? Is that what you're doing? What are some systems that your characters are encountering? What are some institutions and power dynamics that you're upholding that are affecting your characters and their lives? Like, is there, you know, are you falling into those traps, which, you know, science fiction and fantasy for so long has kind of fallen into? Are you codifying certain patterns which are, you know, which have been passed down from the ages and which should rightfully be broken down in this day and age? So reimagining that kind of context, I think, is really important, and to question your assumptions when you're building a world. I think it's really important to question the assumptions. If you're saying this, you know, this is an empire-based magic system, etc., then question why and what are you upholding? Whose power are you upholding? So things like that. I think those questions kind of like, you have to constantly question yourself, right? Like when you're trying to decolonize yourself in your own perspective.
So you just mentioned a few, but are there any set of questions or a revision checklist that you use to make certain you aren't replicating colonial models?
Is that for me to go?
Yeah, like for everyone. You can go first. Like you already mentioned a few, but do you have your to-go questions or anything of the sort?
I don't have to-go questions necessarily. I kind of go with my gut when it comes to that, and I do a lot of gut check when it comes to you know, whether asking my beta readers or sensitivity readers and things like that. So I do get lots of feedback on my work. But I think some of the ways to think about it is you kind of start from your character and you see what are certain goals that your character has, what are certain obstacles, etc. And what does that imply about the context itself and, the world and the power system and things like that. What would your story and your characters look like in a different structure? Like if you made them a different, use different tropes, etc. What would that look like for your story? How would the world look different? How can you, I really feel like, especially when you're decolonizing your fiction, like there is such an element of originality that you can tap into, just because so much of fiction right now is so colonialist, right? Like so much, at least historically, has happened. And then I try and question like different narrative shapes. Like, of course, you have your 3-act structure and you have your hero's journey, which are very colonialist in their own way, but you have other narratives which you can kind of tap into. And so I try to question all of those little pieces, but it totally depends on the story itself that I'm writing.
Thank you. Yulu, what do you have a revision checklist or a set of questions that you usually go to?
Not necessarily. I mean, a lot of times, like I said before, I try to write in regards to using stories from my culture. So for right now, I'm in the world of fantasy. So the book that I'm writing, I took Sleeping Beauty as the example, but I brought it into our world and how it would be in the California Indian world. And I try to find stories of ours that fit kind of like that, not traditionally, but something that is close to that. And then I utilize those in my writing. For instance, in the story, the main character, Remedy, she is the cure for the colonial principles that are going on and to help save the people. And everything happens when she's asleep. So everything happens while she's sleeping in that world. So no one knows what happens to Sleeping Beauty when she's asleep. So this is what it shows there. So it just, again, changing how we view things and making it so that it's not somebody that's coming to rescue her, but that she rescues herself. So I try to find ways on making my characters ones where they don't have to be rescued. There's no people, no damsel in distress, no somebody riding on a horse, knight in shining armor, someone that they have people in their lives that help them get to where they need to be. But ultimately they are the ones that rescue themselves.
When it comes to me, I don't have a physical checklist. However, I do have a mental checklist of sorts. I always ask myself, from whose perspective am I writing? And why did I decide to write from this narrative lens or perspective? And then if my story is about like person versus person, if there's that kind of tension in the story, and then I always ask, okay, who is the villain? Why is this character the villain? What makes him the villain? And what makes the other character the hero? Am I basing my character traits off of colonial principles or ideas? Or am I truly decolonizing my writing and my narrative choices? I always start there. And then from that, I think I am able to kind of direct my writing and make it a little more decolonized. I think it's kind of impossible to completely escape that trap of writing fiction with a colonial lens, because I live in a Western colonial society.
Thank you. So, well, I know there are a few examples, but are there any books you'd recommend that are anti-colonial? If you'd like to start, Monique.
So I really wish I could rattle off a whole list of books, but unfortunately, I haven't personally read any books that are sci-fi and anti-colonial. I wish I have, but I haven't. I think a lot of the things that I've read have the author has either made an active decision to follow kind of like colonial structures, or has just followed along with the tide of writing that way. So I have not, or I cannot recommend any good examples, but I would love to hear some. Let me know.
Have any of you read a decolonized sci-fi book?
There might be one, but it kind of fits into it. It's an anthology. It's called Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time. And it's an indigenous LGBT sci-fi anthology. So there's a few good stories in there that kind of hit on just changing the view and and making it again about what we want it to be like in the future. And so this is a good. It's edited by Hope Nicholson. So if you guys are interested in looking into it, but it's a really good anthology.
I have a few of my favorites. I'm trying to remember all of them because I have so many books that I've read, which are, which at the heart of it have anti-colonialist themes, etc. She Who Became the Sun is a fantastic recent example. A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace directly talks about colonialism and anti-colonialism. Those are just some. The Traitor Barrow Carment is another one. I'm sure like these are like some really recent examples. So I love all of these books. But in terms of like narrative structures, etc., The Heroine's Journey is one which is an excellent book. I think I would recommend that to everyone. It inverses the hero's journey and it talks about it from a very anti-colonialist perspective. There's 4-act structure instead of the 3-act structure, which talks about plot without conflict. Because I think a lot of times you have conflict, which is kind of shown as the main carrier of plot, whereas that is again a very colonialist way of thinking. And so it kind of frames the 3-act structure differently, and it talks about the 4-act structure and the East and the West and the significance of plot without conflict. Then you have other historical framing narratives. You have Kishoten Kitsu, which is a narrative structure itself, which again is a very wildly different narrative structure as compared to like Western structures. There's also Decolonize Your Fiction Writing. I forget the name of the author, but that's the name of the book itself. So yeah, there's a whole lot of different resources out there. You have so many other different kinds of narrative structures as well. And I can leave like that in the notes later or give a link to it later so it can go out to our listeners. But there's a lot of extra info out there if you're looking to actually work on decolonizing your fiction. I'd even recommend 2 people that I think are worthwhile following. One is Vida Cruz on Twitter, and also Nirel, so Erin at also on Twitter. I think they go by NIRELE at Nirel, and they often tweet. Both of these writers often tweet about decolonizing fiction and anti-colonialist perspectives on fiction. So I would give them a follow.
Thank you. I would really appreciate those links to share with everyone. I read an anti-colonial sci-fi, but I'm not sure if it follows the hero's journey. Like, I think it kind of does, but it's still great. It's set in Ghana. It's called Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor. So I recommend it to all of you. It's quite short and it's very interesting. And what would you like to see in the future of sci-fi? Yulu, would you like to start?
Sorry, I couldn't get myself to unmute there. What would I like to see in the future of sci-fi? I think I would like to see just something that's different. We've seen a lot of the same, alien stories, it's the same type of dystopian. I'd like to be able to see something that's not a traditional Western sci-fi story, something that just again shows how far we've come and how we aspire to be different. I'd like to be able to see what that type of world would look like.
I would like to see, personally, this is a personal thing, but I really want to see more Gala Gucci science fiction. I don't think I've read any, actually, and probably for several different reasons. And it's not really it's not a like a very huge culture, big, but we're not all over the map. But yeah, I would like to see more Gala Gucci science fiction in the future. I think that would be cool to like actively pick up a book and say, hey, this is my culture. We're on the map. Here we are. And in addition to that, I love strong women in sci-fi, strong heroines in sci-fi. So definitely want to see more of that. Just a bunch of women doing things, destroying some monsters, maybe, I don't know, but definitely want to see that.
Yeah, I'd like to see all kinds of diverse voices in science fiction and fantasy, honestly. And I think it's going in that direction as well. Not fast enough and not as prolifically as I'd like it to, but over the last little while, I made it like, basically a personal project to read as much like non-white perspectives as I can. So lots of BIPOC authors, lots of trans authors. I would just like to see that trend continuing, and for it to not be a trend, honestly, for it to be a mainstay in publishing. Just as many different perspectives as we can, as many different voices as possible, whether they're LGBTQ or they're BIPOC stories or stories from different cultures that we haven't heard of yet, or religions which don't get the limelight at all, and different perspectives from all of them. I think often in publishing you get one story, you'll get one Hindu philosophy story, and publishing is like, cool, I'm done, that's all that needs to happen. But there's so many different perspectives, and meanwhile you have like 50,000 retellings of Beauty and the Beast. So I'd like as much space as possible for a lot of these other voices.
Yes. Well, that was the last question. So, well, I have one last question for all of you, which is, where can we go if we want to read your stuff or learn more about you? I will post some links if you provide them the day of the recording, but nonetheless, if you could tell us a bit where to find you right now, it would be great. Kritika, if you'd like to.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure if you called on me. You can just follow me at Kritika H Rao. That's my handle. You can see it there. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram, but I am also becoming slowly more and more active on TikTok. And you can find my book, The Surviving Sky, on Goodreads. Although if you go to my Twitter, then the first link will show you exactly how to go to Goodreads. And if you click it and add it to your shelves, then when it's out, you'll get to know more about my work and my story.
Awesome, thank you. Monique, please.
Yes, so you can go to my website, www.moniquejcollins.com. So my name with the J in the middle. You can go there, and also you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. All of my handles are the same, at Nique the Writer, Nique the Writer.
You can find Ope on Amazon. Just Google, it's apostrophe OPE, or you can Google Yulu Ewis, it'll pop up. It's also on Barnes and Noble. My handles are Yulu Ewis, the author, on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And also yuluewis.com. It's still in construction, but it'll be up soon, and you'll be able to find my stuff there as well.
Awesome, thank you very much. Well, I had a great time and learned a lot from you. So I will mail you, like when it's a fact, I will mail you the day and date of the live event. I hope you can attend so you can answer some questions of people that are watching the panel live. And if you could mail me your information so I can post the links on the chat, that would be great. Thank you. I don't know if you would like to comment something or just call it a day.
Thank you. It was fun. It was really fun.
Thank you.
Yes, I was happy to meet all of you, and I look forward to reading your guys' work. Please keep in touch. You can email me on my email on the group chat, and I'd love to continue to talk with you guys.
Same.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Goodbye.
Bye.